The Zephyr groaned like a wounded beast as the ship's systems flickered erratically. A cascade of alarms pierced the tense silence, the shrill wails cutting through the thick haze of smoke that filled the corridors. Lights pulsed and dimmed, their rhythmic flicker casting jagged shadows against the sleek, crystalline walls. The acrid stench of burned circuits hung heavy in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of ozone. Panic rippled through the ship as the crew scrambled to make sense of the failure. "Hyperdrive is offline," shouted a Quillari technician, their translucent, crystalline skin pulsing with frantic, kaleidoscopic hues. Their voice cracked with an edge of desperation. "Primary diagnostics they're not responding." Captain Leora stood in the center of the bridge, her elegant form shimmering like a polished diamond under the erratic glow of emergency lights. Her voice was calm, but the tension behind her words coiled like a spring. "Divert power to secondary systems. Stabilize the core." She paused, her bioluminescent eyes narrowing as she added, "And someone find the human." A metallic clatter echoed through the lower decks as Erik Lawson adjusted his grip on his toolbox. He moved quickly, boots thudding against the alloy floor, his face shadowed with a layer of grime that matched the smudges on his worn cargo pants. The ship shuddered violently, throwing him off balance. Catching himself against the bulkhead, he muttered under his breath, "Hell of a ride these aliens have here." The engine bay was chaos incarnate. Sparks sprayed from a ruptured plasma conduit, and smoke poured from a fractured panel like a malevolent spirit escaping its confines. Erik stepped inside, the heat wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. He pulled a bandana from his back pocket, tying it over his mouth and nose as his eyes scanned the room. "Who in the 7 systems authorized that mess?" Erik gestured to a sparking console where 2 Quillari engineers hovered helplessly. One of them shot him a disdainful look, their crystalline form dimming in offense. "Human!" the engineer snapped, their tone sharp as a blade. "Your tools are primitive. Your expertise? Questionable. What do you think you can do that we cannot?" Erik raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth quirking into a lopsided grin. "For starters, I can stop standing around and gawking like a deer in headlights." He set his toolbox down with a loud clang, the sound cutting through the din. "Now, are you going to help, or are you just here for the commentary?" Captain Leora entered, her commanding presence demanding attention. Her gaze swept over the chaos before landing on Erik. "The hyperdrive is beyond repair," she said flatly. "Our systems can't even pinpoint the source of the failure." Erik crouched near the exposed plasma conduit, running a calloused hand over the scorched edges. The smell of burning insulation stung his nostrils, but he focused on the problem before him. "Let me guess," he said, not looking up. "Your fancy diagnostics told you there's a cascading overload in the main matrix, but no idea why?" Leora's silence was answer enough. Erik let out a low whistle, pulling out a tool that looked laughably basic compared to the ship's sleek interfaces. "You're dealing with too many fail-safes," he muttered. "Your system's too smart for its own good, keeps looping errors instead of actually fixing anything." One of the engineers huffed. "And what would you suggest? A hammer?" They practically spat the word. "Actually, yeah." Erik's grin widened as he tapped a panel with the end of his wrench. "Sometimes the old ways are best." He stood and faced the captain, his tone shifting from playful to serious. "I'll be straight with you. Your hyperdrive is toast. The good news? I can rig up a bypass to get us moving again. The bad news? It won't be pretty." Leora's glowing eyes narrowed. "Define not pretty." "It'll look like a junkyard exploded back here." Erik's voice carried a lightness that didn't quite hide the gravity of the situation. "But it'll work." Her crystalline form dimmed slightly, a subtle sign of doubt. "We don't operate with improvised solutions." "Then you're stuck here," Erik said bluntly, leaning against the bulkhead. "Unless you know another engineer who can make a starship move without a working hyperdrive." The room fell silent except for the occasional sputter of sparks. Leora's gaze held Erik's for a long moment before she gave a sharp nod. "Do it." Erik didn't wait for further instruction. He dropped to his knees and opened his toolbox, pulling out tools that looked hopelessly outdated by alien standards, wrenches, screwdrivers, a battered soldering iron. The Quillari engineers exchanged uneasy glances, their crystalline bodies shimmering faintly with disdain. As Erik worked, the heat in the room seemed to intensify. Sweat dripped down his brow, stinging his eyes as he pried open a panel and inspected the tangled mess of wires beneath. The hum of malfunctioning systems buzzed in his ears, drowning out the distant chatter of the crew. "Hand me that conduit," he said, pointing to a sleek cylindrical component lying on the floor. When no one moved, he looked up and raised an eyebrow. "What? Do I need to say please?" Reluctantly, one of the engineers picked up the conduit and handed it to him. Erik smirked as he secured it into place. "See? We're bonding already." The minutes stretched into hours as Erik worked tirelessly, his hands moving with practiced precision. He stripped wires, soldered connections, and bolted mismatched components together, creating a patchwork of alien tech and human improvisation. The faint metallic tang of solder filled the air, mingling with the ever-present scent of scorched circuitry. At one point, Leora crouched beside him, watching his progress. "You seem confident," she said, her tone neutral, but her expression unreadable. Erik glanced at her, his eyes glinting with determination. "Confidence isn't the same as certainty," he admitted. "But sometimes, you've just got to take the shot." The ship shuddered again, and a warning klaxon blared overhead. Erik swore under his breath, tightening a bolt with quick, forceful turns. "If this thing holds together," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, "I'm buying myself the fanciest drink the galaxy has to offer." Finally, Erik stood, wiping his hands on his grease-streaked pants. He stepped back to survey his work, a haphazard yet functional array of conduits, wires, and patched panels that looked more like a scrapyard sculpture than a hyperdrive bypass. One of the engineers stared at it in horror. "You can't be serious. This is madness." Erik grinned and clapped them on the shoulder. "Madness? Number this is engineering." He turned to Leora. "We're ready to test it. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to stay stranded." Leora's gaze flicked to the jury-rigged contraption, then back to Erik. Her expression hardened as she gave a single nod. "Do it." Erik's hand hovered over the activation panel, his fingers steady despite the weight of the moment. He glanced at the crew, his grin turning mischievous. "Buckle up. This might get bumpy." And with a press of a button, the room erupted into chaos. The Zephyr shuddered violently as Erik pressed the activation button. A low-pitched whine filled the engine bay, growing into a vibrating hum that seemed to rattle the very bones of the ship. The makeshift contraption of mismatched wires and patched panels sparked to life, blue and green lights flickering across its surface like fireflies trapped in a bottle. For a moment, Erik thought it was going to hold, and then it didn't. With a deafening crack, one of the conduits exploded, sending a spray of molten sparks across the room. The vibration turned into a full-blown tremor, throwing Erik and the nearby Quillari engineers to the floor. The alarms blared again, their wails louder and more insistent this time. "Kill it! Shut it down now!" Captain Leora's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "I'm trying!" Erik shouted, scrambling to his feet. His hands flew across the controls, bypassing safeties and cutting power to the system. The hum of the engine sputtered and died, leaving a tense, charged silence in its wake, broken only by the hiss of steam and the metallic groans of the cooling machinery. Erik leaned against the wall, catching his breath. His face was smeared with soot, his shirt singed at the edges. He turned to the gathered crew, who were staring at him with expressions ranging from disbelief to outright contempt. One of the engineers, a particularly disdainful Quillari with a sharp, crystalline jawline, stepped forward. "This is what you call engineering?" they sneered, their translucent skin glowing a faint red with indignation. "You've turned our engine bay into a war zone." Erik wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, his expression unbothered. "War zone, maybe. But it didn't blow the ship apart, did it?" He pointed at the still-smoking contraption. "That was just a stress test. Now I know where the system's weak points are." "You call this progress?" the engineer snapped, their tone icy. "You're jeopardizing the entire crew." "Jeopardizing the crew?" Erik shot back, his voice rising. "Without this, you'll be stuck in this starless void until your air recyclers give out. But hey, if you got a better idea, I'm all ears. Enough. Leora's voice was cold, commanding. She stepped between Erik and the engineer, her glowing eyes narrowing as she regarded both of them. We don't have time for arguments. Lawson, can you fix this? Erik took a deep breath, his mind racing. Yeah, I can fix it, but it's going to take time and a hell of a lot of improvisation. I need access to the ship's cargo hold. If there's anything there, I can scavenge. I can reinforce the system. Leora tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. The cargo hold contains vital equipment and artifacts. Are you certain you can make use of it without causing further damage? Erik's grin returned, tired but genuine. Captain, if there's one thing humans are good at, it's making miracles out of junk. Very well, Leora said, her tone clipped. You have access to the cargo hold. But understand this, if you fail again, we won't have another chance. The tension in her words wasn't lost on Erik. He gave a mock salute, more to lighten the mood than out of any real disrespect. Yes, ma'am, I'll make it work. With that, Erik grabbed his tools and headed toward the cargo hold, trailed by a pair of skeptical engineers who had been assigned to assist him, or more likely, to keep an eye on him. The walk to the hold was quiet, save for the faint hum of emergency power systems. The corridors of the Zephyr, usually pristine and glowing with soft light, now seemed cold and dim, the flickering panels casting ghostly reflections on the crystalline walls. The cargo hold was massive, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadow. Stacked crates and shimmering containment fields lined the walls, filled with everything from spare ship components to alien artifacts whose purposes Erik could only guess at. The air was cold and carried a faint metallic tang, like the inside of an ancient vault. Right, Erik said, clapping his hands together. Let's see what we've got to work with. The Quillari engineers exchanged doubtful glances as Erik began prying open crates and inspecting their contents. His movements were quick and efficient, his hands running over components with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years scavenging for parts. He muttered to himself as he worked, cataloging the materials. Plasma regulators, good. Conduit tubing, perfect. What the hell is this thing? No idea, but it looks important. One of the engineers finally broke their silence. You act as though you know what you're doing, but this isn't a human scrapyard. These components are advanced? Superior? Erik interrupted, glancing over his shoulder. Yeah, I've heard it all before. Let me tell you something. Doesn't matter how fancy the tech is, it's all just metal and circuits at the end of the day. The trick is making it do what you want. The engineer's crystalline form shimmered faintly, a sign of their irritation. You humans are reckless. Erik laughed, a low, rough sound. Maybe, but reckless got me here, didn't it? Hours passed as Erik worked tirelessly, cobbling together a new system from the scavenged components. He fashioned makeshift conduits from tubing, spliced alien wiring with human connectors, and even repurposed a Quillari artifact as a stabilizer, though he had no idea what its original purpose had been. The Quillari engineers watched in a mix of fascination and horror as Erik assembled the hybrid engine. Sparks flew as he welded components together, the acrid smell of burning metal filling the air. His hands were a blur of motion, every gesture deliberate and precise. You really think this will work? One of the engineers asked, their voice tinged with reluctant curiosity. Erik paused, wiping his hands on his grease-streaked pants. Do I think it'll work? Number. He grinned, his eyes glinting with determination. I know it'll work. The ship groaned again, a reminder of the ticking clock they were all racing against. Erik straightened, cracking his knuckles as he surveyed his work. The new hybrid system was far from elegant. It looked more like a Frankenstein's monster of wires and metal than a proper engine. But it was solid. It would hold. He turned to the engineers, his grin widening. All right, let's get this beast installed. And before you ask, yes, it's going to look ugly. And yes, it's going to work. They didn't argue this time. Together, they transported the makeshift system back to the engine bay. The air was thick with tension as Erik began integrating the hybrid engine into the ship's systems. Every connection, every adjustment felt like a gamble, but Erik's hands never faltered. As he worked, the room grew silent save for the hum of machinery and the occasional crackle of electricity. The crew watched from a safe distance, their expressions ranging from wary to hopeful. Finally, Erik stepped back, wiping his hands on his pants. He turned to Leora, who stood at the edge of the room, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "It's ready," he said simply. Leora's crystalline form shimmered faintly, her version of a raised eyebrow. "You're certain this won't destroy the ship?" Erik smirked, his confidence unwavering. "Only one way to find out." As the captain gave the order to activate the system, the room seemed to hold its breath. Erik's fingers hovered over the control panel, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He glanced at the crew, his grin returning. "Round 2. Let's hope this one doesn't explode." And with that, he pressed the button. The engine bay erupted in sound and motion as Erik activated the hybrid propulsion system. A deep, resonant hum filled the room, vibrating through the walls and into their very bones. The contraption of mismatched conduits and scavenged parts lit up like a small, chaotic sun, throwing off flickers of blue and gold light. For a brief, glorious moment, it seemed to be working. Then the tremors started. The Zephyr groaned, its sleek structure protesting under the strain of the unfamiliar system. Sparks burst from a junction box, casting erratic shadows across the tense faces of the crew. Erik's heart hammered as he scrambled to adjust the power flow, his fingers moving like lightning over the controls. "Pressure in the main conduit is rising," one of the Quillari engineers shouted, their voice high with panic. "If it overloads—" "It's not going to overload," Erik snapped, his voice sharp but steady. He yanked a lever, diverting power away from the overheating section. The hum of the engine evened out, though the ship still shuddered with every pulse. Behind him, Captain Leora stood like a statue, her crystalline form glowing faintly in the chaotic light. "Lawson," she said, her tone deceptively calm, "how long can this system hold?" Erik didn't look up from his work. "Long enough to get us moving," he said, gritting his teeth as he tightened a connection. "But if I can't stabilize the core, we're looking at one hell of a fireworks show." The captain's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "Do what you must." Erik muttered a string of curses under his breath as he dove back into the tangled mess of wires and components. The heat in the room was oppressive, the air thick with the smell of burning metal and the faint, acrid bite of coolant. Sweat dripped from his brow, stinging his eyes, but he didn't dare stop. "Hand me that stabilizer," he barked, pointing at a sleek, cylindrical device on the floor. One of the Quillari engineers hesitated, their glowing hands hovering uncertainly over the component. "Now!" Erik's voice cracked like a whip, snapping the engineer into action. They passed him the stabilizer, their crystalline fingers brushing his grime-streaked hand. Erik jammed it into place with a forceful twist, sparks flying as the device locked into the system. The ship gave a sudden lurch, and a sharp, high-pitched whine filled the room. Erik's gut clenched as he realized what was happening. "Power surge in the secondary conduits," he said, his voice tight. "We need to bleed off the excess before it fries the whole system." "Suggestions?" Leora asked, her glowing eyes fixed on him. Erik didn't hesitate. "Open the emergency venting ports. It'll release the pressure, but it's going to get loud." Leora gave a sharp nod, issuing the command to the bridge. Moments later, a deep thunk reverberated through the ship as the venting ports opened. The engine bay was filled with a deafening roar as a column of superheated plasma shot out into the void, bathing the walls in flickering red light. The crew winced, their hands covering their ears, but Erik only grinned. "Beautiful," he muttered, adjusting the power flow with a practiced flick of his wrist. The hum of the engine settled into a steady rhythm, the ship's vibrations evening out. For the first time in hours, the room felt almost calm. Almost. "Core stability is at 63%, one of the engineers reported, their voice trembling. "It's holding, but barely." Erik leaned against the console, his muscles aching from hours of strain. He glanced at the glowing readouts, his mind racing. The hybrid system was working. Against all odds, it was working, But it wasn't sustainable. They needed a permanent solution, and fast. His gaze drifted to the captain, who was watching him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said, straightening. "This system is a patch job. It'll get us moving, but if we push it too hard, it'll tear itself apart." Leora's expression didn't waver. "What do you need?" Erik hesitated, his mind running through the possibilities. Finally, he sighed. "Time, and a miracle." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, their shimmering forms dimming with uncertainty. Erik ignored them, focusing instead on the task at hand. He knew the odds were against him, but he also knew one thing. Humans didn't back down from a challenge. As the ship began to accelerate, Erik felt a small spark of hope. The stars outside the viewport blurred into streaks of light, a sign that the Zephyr was finally moving. The hybrid engine hummed steadily, its mismatched parts glowing faintly in the dim light. But the tension in the room was palpable. The crew watched Erik like hawks, their doubt and fear written on their faces. Even the captain, who had shown more faith in him than the others, seemed on edge. One of the engineers broke the silence. "How can you be so confident?" they asked, their voice trembling. "Your methods are reckless." Erik turned to them, his expression serious. "Confidence isn't about knowing everything will go right," he said. "It's about knowing you can handle it when things go wrong." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, the crew seemed to see him in a new light, not as a primitive human, but as someone who thrived in chaos, someone who could find solutions where others saw only problems. The moment was broken by a sudden jarring clang from the hybrid engine. Erik's head snapped around, his heart sinking as he saw a plume of smoke rising from one of the conduits. "Damn it," he muttered, grabbing his wrench. "Looks like we've got a hot spot." He dove back into the fray, his hands moving with the speed and precision of a man who had spent his life solving impossible problems. The crew watched in stunned silence as he wrestled with the failing component, his determination burning brighter than the sparks that flew around him. "Hold together," he murmured, tightening a bolt with a grunt of effort. "Come on, you piece of junk, hold together." Finally, the smoke began to clear, and the engine's hum returned to its steady rhythm. Erik sat back on his heels, his chest heaving with exertion. He glanced up at the crew, a tired but triumphant grin on his face. "Still think humans are reckless?" he asked, his voice laced with humor. The engineer who had doubted him earlier hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. "Perhaps a little recklessness is what we needed." Erik laughed, the sound echoing through the room. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. For the first time, he felt a flicker of respect from the crew, a sign that they were beginning to see the value in his unorthodox methods. But the work wasn't done. As the ship continued its journey, Erik knew the hybrid system would need constant monitoring. The slightest misstep could spell disaster. Still, he couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. Against all odds, they were moving. And as long as they were moving, Erik would find a way to keep them going. The hybrid engine thrummed steadily now, its patchwork of human ingenuity and alien precision holding together under the strain. The Zephyr glided through the void, but the tension among the crew was far from resolved. Erik Lawson leaned back against the engine bay wall, his muscles screaming in protest after hours of relentless work. Sweat dripped from his brow, streaking through the soot on his face, but his lips twitched in a faint smile. For the first time since the disaster struck, he allowed himself a flicker of hope. "Don't get comfortable," Captain Leora said from behind him, her crystalline form shimmering faintly. Her tone was calm, but her glowing eyes betrayed her unease. "We're holding together for now, but the core stability is still at 63%. If it drops below 50%, we won't survive the backlash." Erik let out a low chuckle, wiping his hands on his grease-streaked pants. "Captain, I wouldn't dream of getting comfortable. This baby needs constant attention, or she'll bite us in the—" The ship shuddered violently, cutting him off mid-sentence. A warning klaxon blared, and the lights in the engine bay flickered ominously. Erik was on his feet in an instant, his heart pounding as he rushed to the nearest console. "What now?" he muttered, his fingers flying across the control panel. The readouts displayed a cascade of errors, each one more alarming than the last. His stomach dropped as he realized what was happening. Pressure in the auxiliary conduit is spiking. If we don't relieve it— "Explain," Leora demanded, stepping closer. Her tone was sharp, but there was a thread of worry beneath it. Erik looked up, his face grim. "If we don't relieve the pressure, the whole system's going to blow. We're talking chain reaction, catastrophic failure, big fireworks show." The crew froze, their shimmering forms dimming in fear. Erik clenched his jaw, his mind racing. This was it, the moment where everything he'd worked for could fall apart. "Options?" Leora pressed, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Erik exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think. "We need to vent the auxiliary conduit manually. The automated systems aren't responding, and the fail-safes are shot." One of the engineers stepped forward, their translucent face pale. "Manual venting? That's suicide. The plasma will incinerate anyone who gets too close." "Not if you know what you're doing," Erik said, his tone firm. He grabbed his toolkit, slinging it over his shoulder. "I'll do it." Leora's eyes narrowed. "Lawson!" "There's no time to argue," Erik snapped, already moving toward the access hatch. "You said it yourself. If the stability drops below 50%, we're done. This is the only way." For a moment, Leora looked as though she might protest, but then she nodded. "Be quick." Erik climbed through the cramped access tunnel, the heat intensifying with every step. The metallic walls radiated an oppressive warmth, and the air grew thick and stifling. Sweat dripped from his chin as he reached the venting control panel, the faint hum of the plasma conduit vibrating through his boots. "All right, Erik," he muttered to himself, pulling out his tools. "Let's make some magic." The venting control panel was a mess of scorched wires and melted circuits. Erik worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced precision. The smell of burning metal filled his nostrils, and the heat pressed against his skin like a living thing. Every second felt like an eternity as he bypassed the damaged systems, rerouting power to the manual controls. "Lawson, report!" Leora's voice crackled through his comms. "Almost there," Erik replied, his voice strained. "Just a little more." The ship shuddered again, a deep groan reverberating through the walls. Erik's heart raced as he tightened the final connection. He flipped a switch, and the control panel lit up, the vents coming to life with a sharp hiss. "Got it!" he shouted. "Venting now!" A deafening roar filled the tunnel as superheated plasma was released into the void. The air vibrated with energy, and Erik shielded his face as the heat surged around him. For a terrifying moment he thought the conduit might rupture, but then the roar subsided, and the vibrations evened out. "Pressure's dropping," he said, his voice shaky with relief. "We're back in the green." "Good work," Leora said, her tone softer than usual. "Now get back here." Erik didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled back through the tunnel, his body aching from the strain. When he emerged into the engine bay, the crew was waiting, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief. "You're insane," one of the engineers muttered, shaking their head. But it worked. "Insane?" Erik grinned, wiping the sweat from his face. "I prefer innovative." The ship gave a gentle lurch as the hybrid engine stabilized, its hum settling into a smooth, rhythmic pulse. Erik felt a surge of pride as he watched the readouts on the console. Against all odds, they were moving. Captain Leora stepped forward, her crystalline form shimmering faintly in the flickering light. She extended a hand to Erik, her expression unreadable. "You've done what none of us thought possible. The Zephyr owes you its survival." Erik hesitated for a moment, then took her hand, his grip firm. "Just doing my job, Captain." Her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "A job well done." As the ship continued its journey, the crew began to relax, their tension easing with every passing minute. The hybrid system would need monitoring, but for now, it was holding. Erik leaned against the console, his exhaustion finally catching up to him. "Lawson," Leora said, drawing his attention, "we're approaching the repair station. Once we dock, the Galactic engineers will want to see your creation." Erik chuckled, the sound low and tired. "They're going to have a field day with this thing." Leora tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Perhaps they'll learn something from it." "I know we have." Erik didn't respond immediately. He stared out the viewport, watching as the stars blurred into streaks of light. The journey had been grueling, but he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. For all their doubts and skepticism, the crew had come to respect him, not just as an engineer, but as a human. As the repair station came into view, its massive structure glowing against the darkness, Erik straightened. There was still work to be done, but for now he allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. "All right, Zephyr," he murmured, patting the console. "Let's bring you home." The ship glided toward the station, its hybrid engine humming steadily, a testament to the power of human ingenuity and determination. And as Erik watched the station grow larger in the viewport, he couldn't help but smile. They had made it. Against all odds, they had made it. The Zephyr docked with a resounding clunk, the massive repair station swallowing the ship like a whale enveloping a minnow. Outside the viewport, the station's sprawling structure stretched endlessly, glowing with the soft, pulsating light of thousands of repair drones zipping through the void. Inside the ship, a heavy silence filled the engine bay, the crew exchanging tired but relieved glances. Erik Lawson stood at the console, staring at the hybrid engine as it finally wound down. The rhythmic hum that had become a constant backdrop to their journey faded into silence, replaced by the gentle ambient hum of station power flowing through the ship's systems. He let out a long breath, his muscles finally unclenching as the weight of their ordeal lifted. "Well," Erik said, his voice rough from exhaustion but carrying a note of triumph, "looks like she made it." Captain Leora approached, her crystalline form shimmering with a faint golden glow that Erik had come to recognize as relief. "You did it," she said simply. Her voice, usually clipped and commanding, held a rare softness. "The Zephyr owes its survival to you." Erik wiped his hands on his grease-streaked pants, giving her a lopsided grin. "I had help," he said, nodding toward the Quillari engineers who had grudgingly assisted him. "Even if they thought I was nuts half the time." One of the engineers, the same one who had doubted him the most, stepped forward. Their glowing skin flickered with an embarrassed hue, but they met Erik's gaze. "Your methods were unconventional," they admitted, their voice hesitant. "But they worked." "I underestimated you, Lawson." Erik chuckled, reaching out to clap the engineer on the shoulder. "Underestimating humans is a galaxy-wide pastime. Don't worry, you're in good company." Before the conversation could continue, the engine bay doors slid open with a hiss, and a team of station engineers entered, their uniforms pristine and their tools gleaming. They paused, their expressions shifting from professionalism to open astonishment as their eyes fell on Erik's hybrid creation. "What in the name of the stars is that?" one of them muttered, stepping closer to the tangled mess of conduits, wires, and welded panels. "That," Erik said, stepping forward and crossing his arms with a grin, "is what got this ship here in one piece." The lead engineer turned to Captain Leora, their brows furrowed. "This contraption was responsible for propulsion?" Leora nodded, her tone firm. "It is unconventional, but without it, the Zephyr would still be stranded in the void." The station engineers exchanged incredulous looks before one of them gestured toward Erik. "You? You built this?" "Guilty as charged," Erik replied, leaning against a nearby console. "It's not pretty, I'll admit, but it got the job done." The lead engineer shook their head in disbelief. "This is impossible. Integrating Quillari tech with scavenged parts? It shouldn't even function." Erik shrugged, his grin widening. "Sometimes you've got to think outside the manual. Fancy tech is great, but it doesn't mean much if you can't improvise when things go sideways." For a moment the station engineers stood in stunned silence, their eyes darting between Erik and the hybrid engine. Then slowly, the lead engineer nodded. "We'd like to examine this device in detail. It could revolutionize emergency repair protocols across the galaxy." "Be my guest," Erik said, stepping aside with a mock bow. Just don't forget to credit Earth when you start writing your papers. Leora's lips quirked into the faintest hint of a smile as the station engineers moved in to inspect the engine. She turned to Erik, her gaze steady. You've proven yourself more than capable, Lawson. The Zephyr was fortunate to have you aboard. Erik straightened, his grin fading into a more serious expression. It wasn't just about fixing the ship, he said, his voice low but firm. It was about showing you and everyone else that humans bring something unique to the table. We're not perfect. We don't have your precision or your tech. But when things go wrong, we find a way to make it work. Leora inclined her head, her crystalline form glowing faintly. You've made that abundantly clear, and I, for one, will not underestimate humans again. Before Erik could respond, the station's intercom crackled to life. Captain Leora, you are requested in the central briefing room for debriefing. Please bring Chief Engineer Lawson with you. Erik blinked, surprised. Chief Engineer? Leora gave him a pointed look. The title is well earned. As they walked through the station's gleaming corridors, Erik couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. The Kolari crew who had doubted him now looked at him with something approaching respect, their crystalline forms glowing faintly as they passed. It wasn't just about fixing the Zephyr anymore. It was about proving humanity's worth in a galaxy that often dismissed them as primitive. The central briefing room was a stark contrast to the chaotic engine bay. Its walls were smooth and polished, glowing faintly with the soft light of embedded panels. A group of high-ranking officials from various species sat around a circular table, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical as Erik and Leora entered. Captain, one of the officials said, their voice smooth and measured, we've reviewed your preliminary report. This hybrid propulsion system is unprecedented, and it was designed by a human? Leora nodded, gesturing toward Erik. Chief Engineer Lawson is responsible for the design and execution. Without his efforts, the Zephyr would have been lost. The officials turned their attention to Erik, their gazes sharp and assessing. Erik shifted under the scrutiny but held his ground, his grin returning. What can I say? Humans are full of surprises. One of the officials leaned forward, their expression thoughtful. This system you created, it's rough, but its ingenuity is undeniable. We've always known humans were adaptable, but this goes beyond that. You've shown us the value of flexibility, of thinking beyond our rigid protocols. Erik shrugged, his grin widening. Adaptability's in our DNA. When life gives you lemons, you don't just make lemonade, you build a damn lemonade stand. The room fell silent for a moment before one of the officials chuckled, a sound that broke the tension like a crack of thunder. The others soon followed, their laughter filling the room. Lawson, the lead official said, their tone warm. You've done more than save a ship. You've reminded us all of the importance of creativity and resourcefulness. The galaxy could use more engineers like you. Erik raised an eyebrow, his grin turning sly. Well, if you're offering a job, my rates are reasonable. The room erupted in laughter again, and even Leora's lips curved into a rare smile. Erik felt a wave of satisfaction wash over him. This was more than he had hoped for, not just saving the Zephyr, but earning the respect of some of the most influential figures in the galaxy. As the briefing concluded, Erik found himself standing by a massive viewport, gazing out at the stars. The repair station's lights twinkled faintly in the distance, and the void stretched endlessly beyond. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Leora standing beside him. "Where will you go now?" she asked. Erik shrugged, his grin softening. "Wherever I'm needed. There's always another ship to fix, another problem to solve." Leora nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've shown us what humans are capable of, Lawson. Don't stop." Erik gave her a mock salute. "Not a chance, Captain." As he turned back to the stars, a new sense of purpose settled over him. The galaxy was vast, full of challenges and possibilities, and Erik Lawson, human engineer and problem solver, was ready for whatever came next.